afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure and an honor for us at the Philosophy Department at the Universidade Federal de Santa Maria to host Professor Carrie Jenkins in this event. Welcome, Professor Jenkins. Carrie Jenkins got her PhD in philosophy at the Trinity College in Cambridge, and also a Master of Arts in Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, where she currently holds a position as Research Chair and Professor of Philosophy. Although she started her career publishing a monograph on philosophy of arithmetic in 2008, her research has been focused on the philosophy of love. In 2017, she published What Love Is and What Could It Be? And more recently, in 2020, with the historian Carla Nippi, she published Uninvited, Talking Back to Plato. Besides, as far as I understand, pre-orders of her new forthcoming novel called Victoria Sees It are available. So again, welcome, Carrie. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks for this fantastic invitation, and thanks to all of you for coming to listen. What I'm going to do, actually, I think my title, Love's Meaning, might have been better phrased as Sad Love, because I am working at a bundle of issues that are addressing the idea that love, and specifically romantic love, is all about the happy ever after, so the romantic fairy story. And I'm going to be talking about how sad love and love that in various ways fails to match up to the stereotype of the happy ever after can point us in the direction of thinking about what love is in a broader way, so that happiness is not really built into the very concept in this sort of definitive way that it is with the romantic conception. So ultimately what that leads me to develop is a theory of what I call eudaimonic love, which has a lot to do with meaningful love, in the same way that a eudaimonic life, I think, has to do with a meaningful life, and not necessarily a happy one in the sense of one that's, I don't know, fun to live. That's why Love's Meaning and Sad Love were two possible titles. The spin I'm actually going to be giving this today is a little bit more in the sad love direction, I'm afraid, but hopefully not in too depressing a way. Under the heading of this conference of philosophical critiques of marriage, what I'm doing here is really of a piece with Elizabeth Brake's work to dismantle or challenge amatonormativity. So this idea that a central, focal, marriage-like relationship is the goal or the normal state for every human being. And that deserves a special treatment and a special place in people's lives and respect and so on. So I'm trying in many ways to chip away at that amatonormative ideal, including all of its associations with what a romantic relationship should be and what a marriage should be. So in many ways, everything I'm doing here is a philosophical critique of marriage, at least the way that it's currently socially constructed. I'm writing my first book on love, which is this one, is called What Love Is and What It Could Be, and my current project is a second book on love that the title of which will be Sad Love, and that's the work that I'm going to be presenting today. And I'm going to be sort of talking through parts of the new manuscript, a new book, and I'll do that till about, I guess 10 a.m. my time. I'm not sure what time that is for you. 3 p.m. I think. So I'm going to talk for about an hour, and then hopefully we can have about half an hour of back and forth Q&A after that. So your comments and your feedback are very welcome at this stage, because I'm still sort of putting my final version of this manuscript together. So let me tell you a little bit of sort of the background and the setting, and then I'll get into the actual content. I don't have a PowerPoint slideshow. I was just explaining to the hosts, I can't. I find it very hard to speak to people if I'm not visible. I feel like I need to have a bit more of a connection or a conversation to make it work. So I'm going to read or talk through a part of the manuscript where I'm discussing the connections between love and happiness, and the idea that romantic love is the happy ever after condition for life in general. I'm doing it in under the context here of thinking about how both love and happiness tend to focus our attention on one person, or maybe two people, but their individual feelings, rather than the broader social context in which this is all happening. Part of the work that was in this book, in What Love Is, was arguing that romantic love is, in quite a large and important part, socially constructed. And so anything that focuses our attention away from the socially constructed elements is potentially a risk factor, because it diverts us from things we need to be able to see and pay attention to, because they can be harmful unless we know what's going on there, or even if we do know what's going on there, they can be harmful, but we can't do anything about it unless we're paying attention. So that's kind of the background of where we are at this point. And so what I say about that is that zooming in on one human and their emotional life has two functions in this context. So firstly, or two parts, I suppose, not exactly function, two parts to it. So firstly, we think of love, romantic love, and we think of happiness as feelings, right? Nice feelings that are things that an individual can experience. And here I'm just talking about the culturally dominant conceptions of what love is and what happiness is. They're located as in the individual as feelings that the individual has, or emotions, or experiences, internal experiences of one individual. So that's one thing that's going on. And then secondly, and relatedly, each of us is made to feel individually responsible for how much love or how much happiness we end up with, right? In a sense, we're made to feel like if we're not doing what we're supposed to do to be happy or to get love, to find love, then that's our fault. That's why we can't have these nice things. So this focus on individuals and their feelings efficiently deflects any awkward questions about the influence of structural issues like racism or poverty on who has what kind of access to the dating market, let's say, or who has access to the kinds of social supports that make a romantic relationship sustainable. So the underlying agenda in all of this that I detect and I talk about both in What Love Is and in the new book, Sad Love, is a small c conservatism. So if we aren't even thinking about the role of social context in this connection, then we are certainly not going to be motivated to work towards any kind of social change, because we won't even be aware that there's something going on here that we could change in that way. So instead, we're primed, we're indoctrinated is probably the right word, with this idea that love is eternal and natural and inevitable and unchangeable, a kind of force of nature that conquers all, and barriers of class and wealth and everything else will somehow magically crumble in the face of its magical, mystical influence. And I don't think that's true. That you can have these exceptional situations, of course, but the general rule of how life goes on is that people tend to date other people who are quite like them. So in my first book, in What Love Is, my first book on love, I should say, there is the mathematics book. There's some poetry as well. But my first book on love, What Love Is, I suggested that it takes a village, my phrase drawn from the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to fall in love, in the sense that, yes, romantic love is partly biological. So there's this evolved biological phenomenon. We are human animals. So there is stuff going on that can be usefully located at the individual level in terms of our meat bodies and what they do and how they've evolved at the species level and all of that. It's not like that's not happening, but the other side of romantic love and how it works is something that is socially constructed, and romance is kind of intensely influenced and shaped by social ideals and expectations. And those give us a kind of ready-made structure or a kind of script for a romantic relationship. And so that's why I have what I call a dual nature theory of romantic love. The biological part's real, the socially constructed part is also real. And I think most of the interesting and important philosophical questions tend to hit up against the intersection of those two things. So which parts of this are coming from biology? What's coming from social construct? And so on. How changeable are both of these things? Because, social change, of course, is possible for the constructed elements, but even biology is not inevitable. It's not something that we are just handed and then stuck with forever. We typically don't think of biology that way in real life. If I have a headache, I don't just sit down and say, oh, what a shame, it's inevitable because it's biology, it's my head. No, I take ibuprofen and I feel better. I change the biology in there in some way. So both of the socially constructed and biological sides of love can potentially be subject to change, although what you might do to change them would look pretty different. But in this context, in the context of my new work, what I'm trying to focus attention on now is the scripting aspect, channeling us all towards a specific kind of normative relationship. When we experience these powerful biological phenomena of, the brain and the body doing what it does when we fall in love with someone, we're kind of channeled into taking that powerful force and creating a normal relationship out of that. So permanent, monogamous, marriage or marriage-like, exclusive, nuclear family forming, so typically leading to biological reproduction, happy ever after relationship. That's the normative model. So that model, that kind of unit that's created by that process, can be seen as a kind of slightly larger individual. In terms of social settings, people are one kind of individual, but the nuclear family is really just another kind of individual, and still can be treated as such, for example, as a consumer in a capitalist society. And this is something that I've learned partly from the work of economist Marina Adshade, who works on the economics of love and sex. And what she's arguing in some of her recent work is that a marriage or a marriage-like relationship, sort of originally when that kind of family-creating mechanism came into existence, was something like a productive unit. So you'd get two people, originally, a man and a woman coming together, sort of like an economic unit, a firm, a business, right? They're going to co-create they're going to be productive together of maybe, maybe one of them is going to work the land and the other one is going to produce and raise children. Okay. But over time, what Adshade argues is that the marriage becomes less of a productive unit and more of a consuming unit, in the sense that a contemporary couple is more likely to consume together than produce together. So maybe they shop for groceries together and they watch the same Netflix account, and they buy a house together and all of that sort of thing. So in that sense, the slightly larger individual units that are nuclear family units continue to operate much like individuals under capitalism. And so, this is why I think someone like Margaret Thatcher would say, as she kind of infamously said, there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And that's, I think, a kind of a very clear statement of a right-wing conception of what society should be or not be. Right? There shouldn't really be one. There should be individual people, and then families, which are simply the slightly larger extended consuming individual. At no point in her ontology could Margaret Thatcher make room for intimate connections of other kinds than the family unit allows. And that's because they're risky, right? They can challenge or destabilize the social order that's created by the nuclear family structure, wherein you just get these slightly larger individuals that become consumers and can be treated in the standard way by capitalism. So to maintain the status quo, all caring relationships other than the romantic couple relationship and child-raising relationships, they get relegated to secondary status. And this is what I think is ultimately behind amatonormativity, the privileging of that normative relationship style. Everything else is always going to have to be less than. So it's treated as being less intimate, less life-changing, less magical, less real, in a sense, and therefore less deserving of social or legal recognition. Okay. So connections to friends, to non-nuclear family, and to community more generally, all of those things get downgraded to this lesser status, and we feel a pressure to focus our most intense feelings of love and care inwards, symbolically within the bounds of the nuclear family's picket fence, right? The iconic container of the individual unit that is the nuclear family, with its boundaries around it that prevent too much of a close connection with community. And we don't talk about that very much, typically, at least not in any very explicit way, but we don't need to, because the pressure is so ubiquitous that it does its work best when it's actually not being talked about. So we kind of more inhale it along with the air that we breathe. But that kind of almost invisible social pressure can be incredibly effective. So there's some research that was published in 2015, and it found that married people tend to have weaker ties to family, friends, neighbors, and so on, than unmarried people. And so if you view this in a certain light, it's making us more manageable, right? It's making society more malleable, and because it's hard for people who are dissatisfied with the way things are to organize at a community level. Those community bonds have been weakened and relegated to a secondary status by this directing of attention inwards towards the nuclear family unit, rather than outwards towards the wider social groups to which we belong. It's still the morning here, so coffee intake is still highly relevant to me. Okay, so Mandy Len Catron, who's a writer and a creative writing teacher, who has done some work and some research on romantic love, is also interested in pushing back against that social pressure to focus attention inwards. And she has used research like that piece that I just mentioned to make informed decisions about her own romantic life. And she also writes, because she's a great writer, she writes about these so beautifully. So I'm going to read a little passage from one of her pieces. She writes essays, mostly nonfiction essays. So this is a piece of Mandy Catron's writing. When my partner and I talk about whether or not we want to get married, what we're really asking is how we want to define our sense of family and community. What is the role of care in our lives? Whom are we offering it to, and where are we finding it? I don't think choosing not to get married will save us from loneliness, but I think expanding our sense of what love looks like might. We've decided not to get married, for now at least. I hope that might be a reminder to turn toward the people around us as often as we turn toward each other. Okay, so full disclosure, Mandy is a friend of mine, but I knew her writing before I knew her, and I already thought it was really impressive and beautiful and very clear. And so, the order of explanation goes in that direction. I'm her friend because I was impressed by her writing. So I am now speaking for myself. I am married, but I still feel compelled to try and follow Mandy's example. Now I'm also polyamorous, so I have other romantic partners as well as my husband. So in that sense, I have already made a kind of conscious decision that I do turn towards others as well as I turn towards my spouse. For care and to give care and to receive care. But simply being polyamorous, I don't think it gives me a free pass here, because Mandy's point is much more expansive and in a sense much more challenging, actually. And including, additional romantic partners is actually still hewing pretty close to the romantic norm. I know it will sound like a very radical departure from certain angles, but it's not really. When I say that I want to follow Mandy's example, I'm talking about my connections to my communities and my friends and my extended families. And I'm asking, how can I be better at turning my attention and care outwards in those directions? That's the question that Mandy's writing inspires me to ask in my own case. So just to be clear, I'm obviously not denying that there is an inward-looking and somewhat individualistic or private aspect to romantic love. That is true as well. And I'm certainly not, I'm not here to tell you that whenever a romance turns sour, you should blame society for that, and not telling you to stop going to your couples counselor or whatever. It's more that what concerns me is this imbalance of attention to one thing, the private and the individualistic, at the expense of another, the social, the contextual, and the broader impact on the individual. So this imbalance of attention is what I think comes with an agenda attached, because small c conservative values, often, of course, flying under the banner of family values, right? Those encourage us to think of a romantic relationship as something that is wholly private, something that goes on behind closed doors, away from public scrutiny, and something that the public has no legitimate concern with, except maybe the regulation of legal marriage. So we're being encouraged not to zoom out. And I think this is like saying pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So it's a distraction. Because in fact, the personal, as the old saying goes, the personal is political. And this phrase, I think, has long been a rallying cry to resist the kinds of family values, nuclear family values, that oppress women and maintain the traditional patriarchal order, which includes that nuclear family structure, of which typically a man is the head of the household. But in many ways, society at large, and I think especially I'm talking about North American society here, it's barely scratched the surface of what it means to say that the personal is political. And we're especially slow when it comes to appreciating the impact of politics on our romantic relationships. So many of us, I think, now finally understand that it was necessary to intervene in politics to extend equal marriage rights to same-sex partners in the US context, let's say. But if you only have a very surface level appreciation of what happened in that struggle, it would be all too easy to regard it as an exceptional situation that has now been dealt with, right? So there was this one group of people that happened to have been left out and they should have been included. Now they are, we're good. Rather than appreciating that it's really one pointy tip on a huge problematic iceberg. And the iceberg is very much still there. So really, I think what we need to appreciate is that literally everything about romantic love and marriage is up for discussion. And all kinds of real and substantive change actually are possible. So until we've learned that, I don't think we'll have really learned the true lesson of 1960s feminism, right? That the personal is political. We are kind of depressingly slow learners when it comes to this stuff. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the paradox of happiness, which I will explain in just a minute why I'm talking about that. But just first, for anyone who's not familiar with this, the paradox of happiness is a long-standing problem. It's cropped up in all kinds of places. Bentham has a version, J.S. Mill has a version, and you know that you can trace its history earlier than that as well. There's a lot of contemporary discussion around it. The paradox of happiness is basically just chasing happiness makes you unhappy, or at least it doesn't make you happy. It's a fruitless enterprise to pursue your own happiness. Sometimes called the paradox of hedonism as well, depending on sort of how you want to cash out what the happiness there is. So the pursuit of happiness doesn't work. That's not a way to go about it if you actually want to be happy. Actually Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, has another pretty famous version of that paradox as well. And contemporary psychologists are sort of researching it and trying to understand why it works that way, and so on. Okay, so that's the paradox of happiness. The reason that I want to mention it here is because I think it carries over into the romantic context, and we get this. So remember that the romantic love is meant to be this happy ever after condition. So pursuing happiness doesn't work. That's the paradox of happiness. So what about pursuing happy ever after? That kind of romantic love. Does that work? And I want to say no. Basically, the same kind of problem arises in that romantic context because we have associated romantic love so closely with happiness, and pursuing happiness doesn't work. Okay, so what I call this the romantic paradox. Really, it's just an application, a special case of the paradox of happiness more generally. And incidentally, the reason I went with romantic paradox rather than paradox of love is because I want to place the blame where it really lies. So I don't think love is the problem. I think romanticness is the problem. So romantic paradox, that's what the issue is. So this pursuit of the romantic happy ever after actually tends to make us pretty unhappy. And so one of the arguments that I need to make here is to sort of clarify, because you might think the application is not that straightforward. The application of the paradox of happiness is not that straightforward. You might think, well, maybe pursuing happiness in general doesn't work, but pursuing this kind of happiness, the romantic happy ever after, maybe that's just fine. That could happen, right? Because, just because something's true in general doesn't mean it'll be true of this particular case. So reading online comments, in general tends to make me feel really bad, but reading the online comments on a cute photo of Labradoodles, that will tend to make me feel just fine. So there is a difference, potentially. So then the question arises, why should I believe that the romantic paradox is really a paradox? And in essence, the answer is it's because of this ever after part in the happy ever after. So I'll go on to sort of explain a bit more about how the mechanics of the romantic paradox, how I think they work, by focusing on that ever after part of happy ever after. So this is the romantic ideal of love as a fixed and static condition. So romantic love comes at the end of a romantic story, because once it arrives, there's nothing else to tell, right? The rest of it's just totally predictable. It stays that way forever. Some of you might know one of Shakespeare's most famous sonnets. It says, love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken, blah, 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 right? So that's a Shakespeare sonnet, really, really romantic. And I think that's why it's remained uber famous, and why you're more likely to hear that sonnet quoted today than some of the others. So his sonnet number 2 is actually about how when you're 40, you'll be really ugly. So you're going to be very sad about that unless you have some kids pronto. So get on with it. That's sonnet 2. Sonnet, the love is not love sonnet is a much more popular one. For obvious reasons. But it has this kind of fixed thinking in it, right? Love is an ever fixed mark. And that strikes me as really quite damaging to relationships. And I think that pursuing that happy ever after is actually pursuing something fixed and static. I think that is a doomed enterprise. I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's likely to make you more unhappy than happy, because I tend to think of a relationship as more like a living creature. It's dynamic and it grows and it changes. And when that ceases to be the case, the creature's no longer alive, right? So the image of love as static and unchanging is a part of this highly romantic idea that fate determines who you're going to experience it with. So people talk about meeting the one, right? Or their soulmate or their twin flame or whatever, their other half, their perfect match. But there's some empirical research, just as there is in the happiness paradox, to suggest that this kind of pursuit might be doomed to failure, or at least not very promising. So this is from 2014. Psychologists Spike Lee and Norbert Schwartz, and they sort of realized that love could be framed metaphorically. Love could be framed in 2 different ways. So it could be a perfect unity between 2 halves that were made for each other. That's the fixed conception, or a journey with ups and downs, right? The static conception, the dynamic conception. Lee and Schwartz wanted to test whether these ways of thinking had an impact on relationship satisfaction, like how good were people feeling about their relationships. And so they had this hypothesis that people would evaluate their relationship more negatively if conflicts arose when they were thinking about the unity framing. So conflict would signal disunity, and therefore would be a huge problem, right, for the relationship, which should be a matter of 2 perfect halves fitting together, unity. Whereas framing love as a journey and something that has progress would make the conflict feel less of a disaster, right? It would hurt less because it's just part of the journey, right? It's not evidence that you're not made for each other or anything like that. So that was their hypothesis. So what they did was that they cued their participants to think about unity or to think about journeys. So in the unity cases, they gave people phrases like "we were made for each other" and things like that. And then for the journey people, they gave them phrases like "look how far we've come" as a cue. Okay, and then they asked those two groups of participants to imagine relationship conflicts between themselves and partners, and then evaluate how they felt about the relationship after doing so. And as predicted, they found thinking about conflicts hurts relationship satisfaction more when they've been cued to think about love as a perfect unity than when they were cued to think about love as a journey with ups and downs. So, so that paper is called Framing Love, for anyone who wants to find it. Framing Love, When It Hurts to Think We Were Made for Each Other, in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. Okay. And that's not the only reason to be suspicious about the idea of a romantic partner being your other half. So one big problem with it that I have is that it encourages us to think of ourselves as incomplete or inadequate if we don't have a partner, because where's the other half of me, right? But the romantic paradox is specifically this practical problem, pragmatic problem. Chasing after the romantic happy ever after will tend to damage the exact relationships that are supposed to result in it. So it's not only a fool's errand, it's not just quixotic tilting at windmills, it's actively counterproductive. Okay. So that is my sort of sense of why the happy ever after conception of love is in real trouble, or causing real trouble. It seems to be going strong for some reason, but I think it's causing real trouble. And it is, in fact, tending to make us sad in a lot of cases. So the next thing I want to do is talk a bit about sad love. And the ultimate goal of this, although I won't be able to talk about all of it in this talk, just for reasons of time, the ultimate goal of this is to make the case for eudaimonic love, which has room for the full range of human emotions, happiness, sadness, everything else, rather than thinking of love as necessarily a happy condition. It's something that is an all-encompassing human condition. But first, I want to talk about sad love and the ways that it's kind of depicted now, and has been for a few hundred years, in order to kind of explain the motivation for my theory, my project in trying to motivate eudaimonic love. So it's not like we don't know sad love exists. That's a real thing. And actually, we don't just acknowledge it, we glamorize it. So if you think about lyrics from popular music, I have a few favorites. I like U2, I Can't Live With or Without You, oh no, disaster. Or Amy Winehouse has, we only said goodbye with words, I died 100 times, you go back to her and I go back to black, 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 black. So there's this kind of really intense, tragic, sad love. Or 9 Inch Nails, I hurt myself today to see if I still feel, I focus on the pain, the only thing that's real. It's not hard to find examples of this. So sociologist Thomas Sheff has a 2011 book called What's Love Got to Do with It? That's about this, actually, about pop music's image of love being very negative and tragic and horrible. And he traces this back to actually the 1930s, when he sees more and more popular love songs start to depict it as overwhelming and intensely painful. But also, and I think this is interesting, as very self-centered. It's always me, I feel this, and quite alienating. It's a really interesting book, actually. I recommend taking a look if you're interested in this stuff and how we get and recycle the stereotypes we have about love when it goes wrong. Sheff's book is great on that. I largely agree with him that love in popular music is very often depicted as an extreme of feeling, and it will either be intense, ecstatic happiness or excruciating loss and longing and desperation. There's nothing in between, and it's usually the second thing, right? The sad thing. And this is not just pop music. Culture generally is pretty obsessed with tragic love. So if you move to high culture, there's doomed and disastrous love all over classic novels like Wuthering Heights or Anna Karenina, or think about operas like La Bohème or La Traviata. Think about plays like Romeo and Juliet. Juliet, when she finds out she can't be with Romeo, she immediately wants to die. And then when Romeo finds out he can't be with Juliet, he immediately wants to die, right? So this is sad love as we collectively storify it, as we imagine it through our narratives, our songs, and our stories. It's never mediocre or boring. It is spectacular and devastating and explosive. It's not the daily grind of grayscale depression. It's this melodramatic tragedy in gloriously intense, horribly intense Technicolor. So that means we're not presented with a subtle range of experiences to compare and contrast happy ever after love with sad love. What we end up with is one fairy tale love story and one total utter tragedy. These are the options that culture offers us. And in fact, even those two stories have a lot in common, because tragic love and happy ever after love are both all about intense feelings, personal feelings, whether they're positive or negative. Those popular depictions are totally consistent with the romantic idea that feelings are where it's at. Feeling is the thing, what love is. Okay, so art and life are not so very separate from one another. Popular songs and classic novels, they wouldn't be popular and classic unless they were really resonating with millions of people. And in fact, it's not just that the songs resonate with real life. There's this tight circle of mutual influence. So life influences art because, we write tragic songs intentionally to try to speak to people and connect to their real experiences. But art influences life as well, partly because the socially constructed aspects of something like romantic love can be thought of as a script that's generated by our cultural storytelling. So one of the metaphors I use in What Love Is in this book is the composite image. So I say, look, if you are constantly depicting love a certain way, all of your stories pile up, like putting lots of images over each other, like a composite image. And then the features that they all share in common emerge in the composite image as these clearly defined contours. And so we keep piling up cultural representations of love, and the features they share in common emerge as clear features, and then become a kind of stereotype or a kind of script that we're expected to follow. And so this means the ways that we represent love as happy or sad can exert a really powerful influence. And it's not just on what we expect from ourselves or others in the sense of what we anticipate, it's also normative. So what kinds of love are socially acceptable, and what kinds are stigmatized or disfavored. So just, we can think about the power of representing queer love, for example, in movies or on TV. If we never see queer love represented at all, then we might have no conception that it is even possible. If we see queer love represented, but only between ridiculous or stereotyped characters, then we're encouraged to kind of distance ourselves from it, maybe laugh at it. If we see queer love represented, but only as sad, then what's going to happen is it's going to really discourage us from trying that, or letting other people try it, right? Because we don't want to be miserable. We don't want our friends or family to be miserable. So we're going to try to steer people away from a road that looks like it only leads to misery, because we only see it in all the stories we know, that road leads to misery. And the only road we know that leads to happiness, or the happy ever after, is the one marked heteronormative relationship. So, it makes people channel everyone onto that road because they think they're doing people a favor. It's a really, it's powerful. It's a powerful phenomenon of social construction making things real in real life. Okay, so there's the story, the boy meets girl story, where they live happily ever after. And there's the tragic story, boy meets girl, doesn't work out, they die tragically. Okay, two stories that we have. These aren't, it's not like those are bad stories intrinsically, there's nothing wrong with them. There are people who experience those things, but the problem is you tell the same story or the same two stories over and over and over without telling any other stories, and then it shifts, something happens, it becomes a script or a norm, right? Not just a story, but a script. And once it reaches that status, it can be weaponized because you start finding people policing each other. You've gone off script. You need to be brought back in. And so this is why stories matter so much. So if you think about our stereotypes of romantic love, they are socially constructed. In a sense, they are made up, right? Grounded in fictions and fantasies, but that doesn't mean they're not real. So they're not made up like Sherlock Holmes is made up. They're made up like how the law is made up, right? Yes, sure, we made it up in some sense, but now it's real. You better treat it as such, or you're in trouble. And so our stereotypical script for a romantic relationship dictates features like monogamy, permanence, heterosexuality, sexuality, to gore, marriage, biological reproduction, a whole bunch of problematic gender norms. I talk about those in quite a bit more detail in What Love Is as well. Now, so we can decide not to follow the script and do something different with our lives, but then we're rebels, right? Because we have deviated from a script. It's not in the same way a totally free choice anymore. And so, being polyamorous, being in non-monogamous relationships, I am not fitting my assigned role in the romantic script because I don't stick to the monogamy norm. So in that sense, I'm rebelling, right? That means I experience the kinds of policing that's designed to keep rebels in line. I get told in a variety of colorful ways that I'm doing something wrong by being non-monogamous. The problem is I'm not a rebel. I don't want to be a rebel. This is massively not fun for me. I'm more like the kind of person who avoids conflict. I cry when people are mean to me. I obey traffic laws even if nobody is watching. I was a really good girl in high school. I worked really hard and I never wanted any trouble from authority figures. Actually, one time a teacher separated me from my friend because we were both giggling in class, and I've clearly never gotten over it. I can still remember that now. So that's what I'm like. I'm not a good rebel, but because I want to live my life in a way that other people decide constitutes rebellion, I have to experience rebel status, and I don't like it, and I don't want to. So part of what's going on there is that I had never heard a story about an open relationship that wasn't a disaster until I was into my 30s. So it just wasn't an option on my roadmap for life. I heard some stories, fictional stories and also true stories from people's lives of non-monogamous relationships that were not at all happy stories. They were oh, hello. Sorry, this is my cat. This is Seven. She's a Sphinx cat, a hairless cat. So she looks like a kind of weird alien goblin kind of a thing. Totally normal. So these stories that I had heard, the relationships were uncomfortable. The people were creepy or immoral or deceptive, and things were always very explosive or in some cases abusive. So they were just bad things that were happening in the stories. And the people in those relationships were not happy people. And so then this story kind of looked like it was going to become self-fulfilling, because when I started to live as polyamorous and tell people about it, people that I cared about started saying awful things about my relationships, and it really hurt, and it made me sad. And when I started talking more publicly about polyamory, I got so much horrible feedback, and then it made me really depressed, because, like I said, I'm not cut out to be a rebel. I'm actually a people pleaser. So being a people pleaser who gets hate mail is very, very difficult. It's not a good time. So this is part of why I'm motivated to try to do something about this. One of the things that I've noticed is how easy it is to erase happiness from representations of love, from certain kinds of love stories. And this erasure, I should say, it doesn't have to be done intentionally or maliciously in order to be effective. Actually, the intentions are pretty irrelevant here, as is so often the case. But the erasure happens. And so, for example, sorry, that's my dog. Here's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. So in 2017, Kevin Patterson, who's a Black polyamorous author, and his wife, Antoinette Patterson, were interviewed for a high-profile New York Times article on open relationships. So there was a photo shoot between the two of them for the article, and the picture that they chose from that photo shoot, Metso shush, hey, relax, okay, good girl. The photo that they chose was really troubling to Kevin. So he wrote about this experience, and here's what he said. I'm not flat out saying that my wife and I are only included as token people of color. I am challenging anyone to show me what the difference would be if we were. Our voices are mostly unused, so they weren't really quoted in the piece, but our faces are pretty prominent in a photo that shocked the people in our lives. One friend said, it's the saddest they've ever seen either of us look. So he's describing here this kind of casual racism of using Black people's images in a tokenistic way while excluding their actual stories. But here it's intersecting with the erasure of a happy non-monogamous love story from the popular imagination. So I've actually seen the photo of the Pattersons that appears in the New York Times article. And what I think it looks like is a cheating husband seeking forgiveness from a long-suffering wife. That's what I think it looks like. That's not their story. That's not how they live. They are happily polyamorous, non-monogamous couple. So Kevin goes on to explain that the article centers a narrative of a white married couple who turn to non-monogamy as a band-aid solution to address their failing relationship. And this is one of those cultural stereotypes that I already knew about before I learned about polyamory. It's, I think, one of the stereotypes we all already know about. This is not really newsworthy, so the New York Times didn't need to tell us this story again. Actually, Kevin puts it this way: the idea that ethical and consensual non-monogamy are just the product of unhappy marriages is already the predominant narrative. We've heard these stories before. They get pushed out to mainstream media every few months, and frankly, it's gotten boring. And it wasn't like the journalist only had sad stories to tell, because the Pattersons had literally handed her a different story and several different images. It's just that all of that got erased from the published copy. And this is how popular media, by which I mean not just kind of niche popular things, but really popular, mainstream popular media, reinforces our socially constructed scripts. And it works. It really, really works. So, so when my book, my What Love Is book came out, I gave lots of readings and some talks and interviews about it, because that's what you do when you publish a book. You're supposed to go and publicize it a little bit. And over time, I started to notice a particular pattern kept coming up in the Q&A and the questions after my talks and readings, which was that people seem to be very, very keen on getting me to talk more about the downsides of polyamory. And eventually I figured out that when people were reading my book or coming to listen to me talk about it, they were expecting misery. They wanted at least a little bit of misery, or they felt kind of cheated. And because I didn't have misery in my book, they came and like tried to push me on that question in live context. So they specifically wanted me to talk about jealousy and how painful and destructive it can be in non-monogamous relationships. And I didn't say much about jealousy in my book. I made a few remarks of a kind of theoretical nature, but I didn't talk about it much in a personal context because it hadn't been a big part of my own experience of non-monogamy. So it wasn't really in the book, so people came and asked for it. And, you know, it was, what was interesting about that to me was not so much that people wanted to hear misery, because there are lots of reasons people like to see that. You know, people are generally fascinated by someone else's train wreck. But it was the fact that they thought they had filled out the details of what the downsides ought to look like, and they wanted to hear me tell that specific story. And that's the testament, I think, to the power of stories. The ones that we tell over and over, very, very powerful. The ones that we never hear don't get to influence us. So this misery-laden stereotype of non-monogamous love is still very much a live stereotype. And actually what tends to happen is that people not only erase the happy stories, they'll also discount them if they do happen to come across them. And so there's a kind of distrust here, which is it's a form of testimonial injustice in the sense of feminist philosophers' labels. So certain groups of people are just discredited even when they have relevant expertise. So you might think, well, at least if we had some good science, some data suggesting that polyamorous people can be happy, then maybe people would trust that. But unfortunately, the answer is still no. Actually, what tends to happen, and there's research on this too, is that data is perceived as being more biased. A study is perceived as being more biased if it favors polyamory than if it favors monogamy. Data that favors monogamy is perceived as less biased. So it's almost as if you want to tell people that other kinds of love can be happy, and they just put their hands over their ears and yell la 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 until you give up. But I still haven't given up. I'm still trying, and so what I'm going to wrap up soon because I know I'm into the last few minutes here. But what I'm trying to do in my current work is shift a metaphor. So we tend to think of love in sometimes in quite combative ways. So we tend to think maybe love is a kind of warfare or a struggle or work or madness even. And I'm trying to shift the metaphor towards one where we think about love as a collaborative work of art. So it's something that we do together with another person or other people in a creative and dynamic way. And the reason I want to do that is because it opens the possibility to think of it as something that you can craft in your own preferred style. So a relationship is not necessarily something fixed and static that follows a set script. It can be something that is dynamic and creative, like a work of art, a collaborative work of art. And so doing it in an original way, a way that doesn't look like the normal way, can be recast not as a rebellion or something experimental which could go wrong and be a disaster, but just as something that is an original move in that field, in that kind of artistic way that crafting generally is understood. Something that we're making together. It's something that we are active in. And something that we're free to experiment in without that being a kind of something that raises the specter of terrible failure, disastrous, explosive, tragic love. That kind of that kind of thought shuts us down. It prevents us from trying things. It prevents us from doing anything other than this very standard, fixed kind of love. And so the concepts I like are concepts like love crafting, or love as an experimental work of art, that a collaborative work of art, sorry, that can be experimental. And so I'm trying to make these kind of metaphorical conceptual shifts. And that's part of what my theory of eudaimonic love will require. But most of all, it means I have to push back on the romantic concept of happy ever after love, which is in many, many ways antithetical to eudaimonic love, especially in the way that it is fixed and static, the ever-fixed mark of Shakespeare's sonnet. And eudaimonic love is absolutely the opposite of that. It's growing, it's dynamic, it's creative, and all of those things. So, okay, I think I've said enough now, hopefully, to introduce you to the broad outlines of what I'm up to. And I'm also out of time. So apologies for the background noises. I'll show you. This is the culprit right here. Yes, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Carrie, very much, and no worries about the the noises are normal. We are always working from home now. Everyone understands that. So we have 3 questions for you here from the YouTube chat. The first one is from Eduardo, our dear organizer. Thanks, Eduardo, for organizing this awesome event.
Yes, thanks, Eduardo. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes. So, how socially, racial, gender, class, etc., diverse must the inhabitants of the village, from your idea, it takes a village to fall in love. This village should be so that love does not become another tool of exclusion.
Yeah, good. So I think the diversity of the village is huge, and I think how the quest, it should be as big as it can be, right? Because really, if you think about the village as, this planet, human experience, that's the ideal. If we're looking at the optimum inputs for not being exclusive, but of course, we can't take in that much information. We're not capable of it, and so we have to simplify for the purposes of understanding anything in life. So there's always going to be this kind of question, the back and forth between I want to understand, which will require simplifying, but I don't want to exclude, which requires complexity. And so those things are always going to be in a certain amount of tension with one another. So my worry is we have currently a situation where simplicity has won out over understanding any amount of complexity at all, really. We just have one story or 2 stories, the happy story and the tragic story. And that's really bad. So anything we can do to include more from there is an improvement, and the ideal level of diversity would be the complete massive range of human experience. It's just that being limited beings, we're never going to achieve that. One of the things I think is useful, given that we can't achieve total diversity, full knowledge of the entire range of human experiences, one of the things that's really important is to remember that all of our simplifications are simplifications. So it's one thing to have a theory, and it's a separate thing to use it as a tool of exclusion. And it's too easy to slip from one to the other. So as soon as we do simplify, we say, well, love is this, and that. It's very easy to then go out and say, well, you're not doing this, and that. So therefore, what you're doing is not love. We don't have to take step 2. we can go step 1. I think maybe love is like this. And then if someone else is doing something different, we could say, maybe I should change my theory instead of, oh, you're doing it wrong. So that we always have that option when we encounter diversity of experience that we haven't accommodated yet. We can, say they're doing it wrong, or we can say maybe my theory is wrong. So it's that attitude more than how many diverse things are included. It's more the attitude of being willing to adjust and accommodate and learn and grow that I think is important. I hope that answers the question. That was a bit of a ramble.
Great. Thanks. So the next question is from Jade. Professor Jenkins, what part does feminist philosophy play in your work about love? And she's saying that she asked this to Break yesterday, Professor Break, and then she would love to hear it from you.
I'd love to hear what Professor Brake's answer was. I'm fascinated by that question for her as well. But my answer is, it really informs everything at quite fundamental level. In my new work, I have a chapter where, in my new book, I talk about the role of the work that feminism's played in my academic life so far. And it goes back actually so when I first started studying philosophy as an undergraduate, I went to Trinity College in Cambridge. And one of the first things I was told was that if I wanted to get a first-class degree, I should write like a man. And that's a literal quote. It's a literal quote, write like a man, because that is what good philosophy writing looks like. And women tend to write this sort of not very, they don't tend to take risks with their arguments, and they tend to just recite things they've already learned. And so they don't get the top grades. So everything from there has been a process of me unlearning that piece of information that I got very early on. When I was in my final year of undergrad, I attended some lectures by Miranda Fricker, who subsequently became, this was like in 1999 or 2000-ish, but subsequently became really well known for her work on feminist epistemology. So she introduced me actually quite early to some of the tools that I was going to need to understand how the oppression of women in the academy was impacting my own learning. But the important thing about that series was it was in a course called Feminist Philosophy that was a special topic, so they didn't teach it every year. And everything else on every other syllabus was basically entirely men, except for feminist philosophy. And in the years when you didn't get feminist philosophy, the other choices were like Wittgenstein or Kant, or, so one dead white guy or the entirety of feminist thought. And that was that was how it was weighted really explicitly in the syllabus at that time. So yeah, this was kind of like, the weird thing is I didn't notice how weird it was at the time. And it's only been, slowly as I learn, I realize, and people help me to see more and more by, doing good feminist philosophy and me being able to appreciate it, that I've become more and more aware of how unbalanced and how wrong what I learned was at that time. Not the things I was explicitly told, but the things I was told implicitly in the selection of texts and coursework and what was important. And so feminist philosophy correspondingly has become, like, as I've unlearned these lessons, feminist philosophy has become more and more important in my work. And in my work on love especially, it's really obvious to me that I can't understand romantic ideology without understanding the gender roles of it, because the romantic ideology is inherently gendered. It has a male role and a female role, and they are, they are very powerful still now. They're not by any means a thing of the past. So again, the short answer would be a huge part. There's a longer answer with some autobiography as well.
Okay, thank you. So before the next one, I would like to make you a question, or maybe two, which is because the last one was about the role of feminist philosophy in your thought. most of what you were saying about sad love, at least at the beginning, made me think about the second chapter of Bell Hooks' book, All About Love, right? In which she talks about the childhood lessons. So my question would be, and it is related with the second one, my question would be, how does your idea of sad love, which is related, of course, to romantic love, dialogue with the idea of other kinds of sad love, like, for example, the love experience that children can have in, when they grow up in contexts of, I don't know, abuse, or even not love, despite for bell hooks we call it love, it's not kind of love. So I would like to hear what you have to say about this connection between the sad love in the context of romantic love, but these other forms of sad love experiences.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to have opportunities to talk more about bell hooks. She's one of the major influences on both my first book and the current book, and especially her, as you said, her move to say that certain things that we tend to call love really aren't love, because they're not good enough. Basically, they don't have what it takes, and so I think she does make a more general point about all kinds of love, that it's rare, actually. It's much rarer than we might think it is. So we might think we've had love, and we might just be wrong. And she has, in a sense, it's a kind of, it can be upsetting to people to hear that, right? To be told, actually, your parents never loved you. I can see why that sounds bad, but I do think actually she's ultimately right about this. A lot of people, it's true that their parents never loved them, and I think so. The work I'm doing is mostly focused on romantic love, just because romance is my core target, the romantic ideology. But a lot of what she says about love more generally informs what I want to say about romantic love, and especially like a lot of contexts that I think are that we call romantic are not love, for the exact kinds of reasons that bell hooks identifies in that context and others. So I'm actually entirely with her on an abusive relationship is not a loving relationship. And I think part of the work that the eudaimonic love concept can do is give people another handle on what's gone wrong with the abusive cases. So really, I'm already under the bell hooks camp, and I'm explaining and I'm adding parts. Her whole theory of love has some parts that are different from my whole theory of love, so we don't agree on literally everything. But she's massively influential, and so her major points in that book, What Love Is, were kind of touchstone moments for my development, and especially my first book.
Great, that's great to know. And as a side note, for the Brazilian public, it has just been translated, All About Love, into Portuguese. So
Cool.
Yeah, it's great. So my second question would be about how does your research connect with anthropological findings about other forms of love that could be or not similar to the romantic love that are sort of located in Western culture, right? So I would just, if you can say.
Yeah. I'm not an anthropologist, and I don't have like all that expertise, but I read other people's accounts of these things, and so from what I understand, the main lesson is that there's so much variation in how different societies and different groups of people across time and place have arranged their societies, and especially things like the raising of children. So the one constant is cooperation. So social cooperation of some kind is very consistent. Humans they seem to need to do that. They're very, very good at it. But how they cooperate varies massively. So, the model that we have is two adults cooperate and they raise their biological offspring, but there are so many other options, like any number of different configurations in which, adults might raise There might be child raising in creche situations, communal child raising. There can be larger or extended families. There can be more involvement of men in child raising, or there can be more adult sexual and romantic-like connections between people that may or may not be related to the biological reproductive side of things. And so if you actually look at what humans do, the only consistent thing is cooperation and inventiveness, right? We're really good at inventing different ways of solving the problem of, raising kids is hard, right? So you have to cooperate to do that. That's a pretty clear one. But how to cooperate, lots of different solutions to this problem. And so the takeaway for me is that many attempts to find a standard model for human relationship building are misguided, because really our standard is diversity, right? That is what we do. That's what we're good at. We're good at being inventive and creative and solving problems in whatever way works. So my main sort of moral from the anthropological work is that. So whenever you see somebody try to take an anthropological perspective and argue that one particular thing is natural, it doesn't work. So, and I mean, you get this kind of Flintstones view of history where you imagine like it really was nuclear families all the way back. And obviously that looks very suspicious, but so does these claims that we all used to live in communal, bonobo-like, everyone was having sex with everyone else kind of societies. It's like, well, some people did and others didn't, right? So neither one of those is more natural than the other for humanity at large. The metaphor I sometimes, or the analogy rather, that I sometimes use is eye color. So it's like someone comes up and argues, look at all these people with the brown eyes. Brown is the natural eye color for humans. And then someone else goes, no, look, all of these people with blue eyes. So blue is the natural eye color for humans. And I'm like, no, humans naturally have a range of eye colors, right? And that is what I think about the natural relationship structures of human experience. So what's natural is the range.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sure, like I said, I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't know.
Yeah, but it was
when I did that, that's the impression that I take away.
Good. Also, now I have the last question, which is more in a personal note, as far as I understand. It's also my question. I was curious about to hear, how do you turn from philosophy of mathematics to philosophy of love?
Right. Yeah. So this is a good question, and I don't know that there's a great answer, except for I've always had a tendency to be interested in a lot of different things, and I don't think it's so much of a turn necessarily as just being able to. So I have. My field of vision is full of shiny objects and different topics that I'd love to work on and things I'd like to do. So, I spent some time over here doing this one, and then I spent some time over here doing that one. There wasn't really any more rhyme or reason to it than that. The one thing that I think is sometimes surprises people is how a lot of the skills that I would use for one are still relevant in the other. So when I'm doing the philosophy of math, I'm still trying as far as possible to think expansively and creatively, like when I'm writing a public-facing book about love. And when I'm writing my public-facing book about love, I'm still trying to construct arguments that really step through and work and get people from A to B as clearly as I can. And so they don't feel as different to me as maybe they do for some people. And I'm not the only one. So, people like Bertrand Russell also did like a lot of math logic, but also wrote public books about love and marriage and stuff like that. So I'm not the only weirdo who thinks about both of these topics. And I just feel like I'm interested in so many things, and that's really why I became a philosopher in the first place. So it's the field that allows me to have that range of interests, and I like it because they do all end up feeding into each other in some way. Yeah.
So apparently we have a last comment related to a previous question. So very thoughtful work about cooperation, not exactly about love, but about how cooperation works in the human and other animals' process of evolution. Why we cooperate? Michael Tomasello. This is a comment from this.
Okay, great. I don't know the Tomasello, but I'm gonna look that up right now and have a read. It's always useful to have these points of just being able to refer people to, because then I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I feel like, I feel like my point about this is should be pretty obvious, right? Human cooperation. Duh. So the more books I have that I can say, yeah, just go read this Ella book. Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate that.
That's the way.
I'm actually going to down right now because I don't have a good memory. Tomasello, Why We Cooperate. There it is. All right, that will be my next Amazon order.
There you go. Well, Carrie, Jenkins, thank you very much for your talk, and for us it was a pleasure to have you here. We expect that, well, in another occasion you can come to the south of Brazil and visit us.
Then we see the world.
Yes. Well, let's hope for that.
After times.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and we hope that we can continue to dialogue in the future.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.